What's your best day at work? Story 1. I was presiding over a small claims case between two elderly neighbors. The dispute? A garden. The plaintiff claimed the defendant had gnome-napped it and was holding it hostage. The defendant countered that the gnome had been abandoned on his property. I could barely keep a straight face as they presented evidence, which included printed photos of the gnome in different locations around the neighborhood, as if it had been on vacation. At one point, the plaintiff dramatically accused the defendant of gnome trafficking. Ultimately, I ruled that the gnome be returned to its rightful owner. But before dismissing the case, I suggested joint custody as a compromise. To my surprise, they agreed. They even started sending each other photos of the gnome on adventures in each other's gardens. A few months later, I got a letter thanking that ridiculous case had actually mended their decades-long feud. That was a good day. Story 2. One of the best days of my career happened in juvenile court. A young man, 16, rough upbringing, multiple priors, stood before me for theft. Normally, this would be another routine case. But something told me to ask him about his life. Turns out he had a passion for cars. I asked, "Do you like stealing them or fixing them?" He hesitated, then admitted he liked working on engines. I made a deal, probation, but only if he enrolled in a vocational program for mechanics. His lawyer and the DA agreed. 2 years later, he came back, not in cuffs but in a suit. He was working at a repair shop, about to get certified as a mechanic. He shook my hand and said, "You gave me a shot when no one else did." That was the first time I truly felt like I changed a life. Story 3. Divorce cases can be brutal, but one day, I saw something amazing. A couple was fighting over custody of their dog, a big golden retriever named Max. Both were adamant that Max would be miserable with the other. I was about to rule for split custody when I asked, "Has Max ever been left alone for a long time?" The room went silent. The ex-wife admitted she worked long hours. The ex-husband admitted he traveled often. They looked at each other and realized neither could give Max the time he deserved. After a long discussion, they decided to share him. But more importantly, they reconnected. 2 years later, I saw them again, walking into the courthouse, but this time for a marriage license. Max had brought them back together. That was a rare happy ending in family. Story 4. One of my most satisfying cases was a landlord-tenant dispute. A woman, single mother of 2, was being evicted. The landlord claimed she hadn't paid rent in months. She swore she had, but the receipts had conveniently gone missing. During questioning, I noticed the landlord got nervous when I asked about past evictions. I requested a review of his records. Turns out he had a pattern. He'd been evicting tenants right before their leases ended to pocket deposits illegally. Not only did I rule in favor of the tenant, but I forwarded the case for fraud investigation. The landlord ended up paying thousands in fines and lost his right to manage properties. The mother came up to me in tears after the ruling. She just wanted a safe place for her kids. That day, justice felt very real. Story 5. One of my favorite days in court involved a traffic violation case. A young man was caught speeding at nearly double the limit, but his excuse was different. He was trying to rush his pregnant wife to the hospital. The officer, by the book, still gave him a ticket. I asked how the baby was. His eyes lit up. "She's perfect, Your Honor." The officer was there, too. I asked if he would have done the same in his position. He hesitated, then said, "Yeah, probably." Instead of a fine, I ordered the young man to take a safe driving course and donate to a local children's hospital. The officer nodded in agreement. Weeks later, I got a card with a baby photo. The note, "Thank you for making the right call." That was a great day to be a judge. Story 6. A man was caught stealing diapers and baby formula from a supermarket. By the book, it was a clear-cut theft case, and he had prior offenses. The prosecutor wanted to push for jail time, citing repeat behavior. Before sentencing, I asked him, "Why did you steal?" His voice shook as he explained his wife had died in childbirth and he had lost his job. He wasn't stealing for personal gain. He was desperate to feed his newborn daughter. I asked the prosecutor to reconsider. Instead of sentencing him to jail, I ordered community service and connected him with a local program that helps struggling single parents. A month later, he returned to court, not in handcuffs but in a suit, holding his baby. He had found a job and was getting back on his feet. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about giving someone a chance to be better. Story 7. This case started as a noise complaint. A woman had filed multiple reports against her neighbor, a single father with a teenage son who played drums in their garage. She insisted the noise was unbearable. The father tried to explain. His son was talented and had been accepted into a music program. But if he couldn't practice, he'd lose his spot. I suggested a compromise, limited practice hours, and the son would play at a local community center twice a week. A few months later, that same woman came back to court. Not to complain, but to thank. She had attended one of the boy's performances and realized just how talented he was. They even became friends. It reminded me that sometimes people just need a little push to see things from a different perspective. Story 8. One of my most unusual cases involved a will dispute. A wealthy elderly man had left his entire fortune to his dog. His children were furious, claiming he had been manipulated. As we examined the will, something felt off. The lawyer who had drafted it had a shady history, and it turned out he had convinced the old man, who was suffering from early dementia, to sign everything over. The real kicker? The lawyer had planned to take control of the dog's trust fund. I invalidated the will and ordered the estate to be split among the rightful heirs. The best part? The family still took care of the dog, even though they had initially been upset. Sometimes, greed exposes itself in the strangest ways. Story 9. A father and son stood before me in court, not as family but as plaintiff and defendant. The father was suing his son over an unpaid personal loan, claiming he had borrowed thousands and refused to pay it back. The son looked ashamed but stood his ground. "I did borrow the money," he admitted, "but I used it to cover my mother's medical bills after Dad refused to help." The father's face turned red. It turned out he had left his sick wife and cut all financial support. The son had spent years trying to keep her alive, and when she passed, he was left with debt. I ruled that there was no obligation to pay back the loan, because it had been used for something the father should have been responsible for in the first place. The son thanked. The father stormed out. Some cases don't have happy endings, but at least, that day, justice was served. Story 10. This case was simple. A little girl wanted to testify. It was a custody battle, bitter and drawn out. The mother insisted she should have full custody. The father, a firefighter, fought for equal rights. Their 10-year-old daughter had one request. She wanted to speak for herself. Legally, children don't always testify in these cases, but I made an exception. I allowed her to sit in my chambers, away from the courtroom pressure, and tell me what she wanted. She simply said, "I love both my parents. I just want to see my dad more." Her words changed everything. The mother softened. They reached an agreement right then and there. No more fights. No more dragging their daughter through court. That was one of the few times I felt like my job truly made a difference in a child's life. Story 11. A man was on trial for assault. The case seemed straightforward. A bar fight, one man injured, the other facing charges. But as I listened, something didn't sit right. The defendant wasn't a violent person. He had no criminal record, was a father, and even volunteered at a shelter. I asked him, "Why did you hit the man?" His lawyer hesitated, but he spoke up. "He grabbed my sister." She said no. He wouldn't stop. The alleged victim had a history of similar incidents, though nothing had stuck in court before. This time, with multiple witnesses confirming the story, I dismissed the charges. The defendant didn't think, he just nodded, as if relieved someone had finally listened. But his sister? She sent a letter months later, saying she finally felt safe again. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about protecting the right people. Story 12. I once had a case involving a teenager who had been caught stealing books from a local bookstore. Not electronics, not jewelry, books. His lawyer said he was just a troubled kid, but I wanted to hear from him. "Why books?" I asked. He looked down and muttered, "I love to read. My family can't afford them." Instead of sentencing him to community service or a fine, I did something different. I reached out to the bookstore owner. She agreed to drop the charges if he worked there after school. Months later, I visited that bookstore. The same kid was behind the counter, grinning as he recommended books to customers. The owner told me he was her best employee. That was a case I'll never forget. Story 13. A woman was being evicted by her landlord for keeping a dog in a no-pets apartment. She tried to explain that the dog was a service animal, her lifeline for PTSD. But the landlord didn't care. Legally, service animals are protected, but the landlord had loopholes. He argued she never disclosed it before signing the lease, and technically, he was right. I looked at the woman. She was shaking. I asked her how long she'd had the dog. "Since my husband died," she whispered. "He's the only reason I sleep at night." I ruled in her favor. The landlord huffed but had no choice. That was a day where the law and human decency aligned perfectly. Story 14. A case came before me that I'll never forget. A grandmother was seeking custody of her 3 grandkids after their parents had abandoned them. The state wanted to place them in foster care, arguing the grandmother was too old to care for them. I asked the kids what they wanted. The oldest, a 12-year-old boy, said, "We just want to stay with Grandma. She's all we have." The social workers had concerns. Her age, her limited income. But I saw the love in that court. I ruled in her favor with stipulations that she receive support and regular check-ins. A year later, I received a holiday card with a picture of those kids, smiling with their grandmother. The caption read, "Thank you for keeping us together." That was a day I knew I made the right call. Story 15. A groom was left at the altar. His fiancée had emptied their shared account and fled, leaving him with nothing. Heartbroken and in debt, he sued her for fraud. She argued it wasn't fraud, just a change of heart. But evidence showed she had planned this for months, taking his money while pretending to plan a wedding. Legally, I could have dismissed it as a bad breakup, but I ruled in his favor. She had deceived him financially, and that was theft. She was ordered to repay every cent. As he left the courtroom, he didn't look happy, just relieved. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge. It's about getting closure. Story 16. A man was caught trespassing on a wealthy businessman's land. The businessman wanted him prosecuted to the fullest extent, claiming he had invaded his privacy and violated his property rights. The man admitted to trespassing, but when I asked why, he hesitated. Eventually, he said, "I was trying to visit my wife." His wife's grave was on that land. The businessman had recently bought the property and had fenced off the small cemetery where generations of local families were buried. The man, in his 70s, had been visiting his late wife every Sunday for decades. I looked at the businessman and asked, "Do you have any family buried here?" He scoffed and said no. I ruled in favor of the trespasser. The businessman was forced to provide reasonable access to the cemetery. The old man thanked me with tears in his eyes. That was the right kind of justice. Story 17. A middle school teacher was facing charges for destroying public property. His crime? Painting over racist graffiti on a school wall. The city wanted to prosecute because, technically, he had committed vandalism. But when I reviewed the case, I saw something interesting. He had tried to report the graffiti for weeks. No one had done anything. So, out of frustration, he had painted over it himself. I asked the city attorney, "Do you really want to send a man to jail for covering up hate speech?" There was an awkward silence. I dismissed the case. A week later, the city finally sent workers to clean up the remaining graffiti. Sometimes, the system fails people. That was one day I got to fix it. Story 18. A woman sued her ex-boyfriend over a $5,000 loan. He claimed it was a gift. She claimed he had promised to pay it back. As I listened, something stood out. She still wore a bracelet with his initials on it. When I asked why, she teared up. Because I loved him. I wanted to believe he would do the right thing. I turned to him and asked, "Did you ever intend to pay her back?" He shrugged. She should have known better. That sealed it. I ruled in her favor. As she left, she quietly unclasped the bracelet and dropped it in the trash. Some cases aren't just about money. They're about closure. Story 19. A 14-year-old boy was caught breaking into cars. The prosecutor wanted him in juvenile detention, said he was a repeat offender. I asked the boy why he did it. At first, he said nothing. But after some silence, he admitted, "I was looking for food." He had been homeless for months. His mother had disappeared. He was surviving on scraps. He wasn't stealing valuables, just loose change, anything to buy a meal. I ordered social services to step in. Instead of jail, he was placed in a foster home with a structured environment. Months later, I got a note from his foster mom. He just won an award for perfect attendance. That was a case where justice meant saving a life. Story 20. A woman was being sued by her ex-husband for theft. She had taken the wedding dress she wore at their wedding and set it on fire in her backyard. His argument? He had bought the dress, so it was technically his property. He demanded financial compensation for its destruction. I asked him, "Why do you care so much about a dress from a marriage that's over?" He had no answer. He just wanted to make her miserable. I ruled in her favor. No damages. No repayment. Nothing. As she walked out, she smiled for the first time that day. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about seeing through people's intentions. Story 21. A man was on trial for embezzling funds from his company. The evidence was clear. He had transferred money to his personal accounts over a period of months. But when he stood before me, his face pale and worn, he pleaded not guilty, claiming he had been framed. I had heard that story 1,000 times, but this man seemed different. He wasn't a career criminal or a greedy CEO. He was a low-level employee at a local charity. Curious, I asked him, "Why would someone frame you?" He sighed. "I didn't do it, but I know who did. They just wanted me to take the fall." His story unfolded. He had been manipulated by a colleague who had been skimming money and using him as a scapegoat. I decided to give him a chance and ordered a full investigation into his claims. The colleague was eventually arrested, and the charges against the man were dropped. He wrote me a letter a few months later, thanking me for not just blindly following the evidence, but for listening. That was a rare moment of redemption, not just for him, but for me too. Story 22. A young couple was in front of me in family court, fighting over custody of their child. The mother had recently been laid off and was struggling to make ends meet, while the father, who worked long hours, had moved in with his new girlfriend. I was ready to rule based on the evidence. Both parents were trying, but their circumstances were less than ideal. But then, I asked their 6-year-old daughter what she wanted. She said, "I want to live with my daddy, but only if he promises to spend more time with." The parents looked at each other, tears in their eyes. For the first time, they realized that they weren't just fighting each other. They were fighting for their daughter. I ruled that they both attend family counseling and spend more time co-parenting. A year later, they returned with a note. "We did it. We're happy. And she's happy too." That was a case where the child taught the parents more than I ever could. Story 23. A woman came into court, suing a delivery driver for damaging her property. Her complaint was that the driver had dropped off a large package but failed to move it off her porch, which led to it being damaged by the rain. I looked at her and asked, "Why didn't you just bring it inside?" Her eyes filled with tears as she explained, "I just couldn't. I had knee surgery last week and I couldn't lift anything. My husband passed away last year. It's just been so hard to do everything on my own." The delivery driver, a young man, stood quietly, watching her. He had heard her complaint but hadn't realized how difficult her situation was. He apologized, offering to pay for the damage. But I saw an opportunity for something greater. I ruled that the delivery company should pay the damages. But I also made a suggestion. The driver should help her with her next delivery. Weeks later, I received a card from the woman. "You helped me find my strength again." And the delivery man? He's now my neighbor's best friend. Sometimes, simple actions can heal more than you expect. Story 24. A teenage boy stood before me, charged with hacking into his school system and changing his grades. He was smart, no doubt about it. But this wasn't about skill. It was about a desperate need for validation. As I heard his story, he revealed that his parents were both high-achieving professionals, and he was constantly compared to their success. He didn't feel like he could measure up, so he tried to fix the only thing he thought was within his control, his grades. I could have easily handed down a harsh sentence. But instead, I made a different choice. I offered him a way out. I recommended he take a coding course, suggesting that he channel his talents into something positive. Months later, he came back to me, holding a certificate for completing a computer science course. "Thank you," he said, his eyes bright. "I found something I love to do now." That was a case where the right guidance turned a potential failure into a success story. Story 25. A woman was being sued for defamation. Her neighbor claimed she had spread false rumors about his business, ruining his reputation. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Both sides had strong arguments. I listened carefully, then asked the woman, "Why did you do it?" Her voice trembled as she explained, "I thought he was running an illegal operation. I didn't know who else to turn to. I was worried about my kids." She wasn't malicious. She was just scared. Her neighbor, however, had a history of complaints and seemed to relish in intimidation. It became clear to me that the woman hadn't intended to harm him. She was acting out of fear. I ruled that the defamation charges would be dismissed, but I also ordered both parties to attend mediation to settle their differences. Months later, I heard that the woman and her neighbor had begun to work together, starting a community safety project. It just took one conversation for both of them to realize they weren't enemies. They were neighbors. Story 26. A woman came to court seeking justice for her stolen bicycle. She had saved up for months to buy it, and it was her only means of transportation to work. The suspect, a young man in his late teens, was arrested after a witness saw him riding the bike. When I asked the young man why he stole it, he confessed but seemed genuinely remorseful. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I was just desperate. My mom's sick, and I needed the money to get her medicine." The woman looked at him, her anger still visible. But then, something in her softened. "I know what it's like to care for someone who's sick," she said quietly. "I'd just rather have my bike back." I ruled that the young man would return the bike, but instead of jail time, he was ordered to do community service and attend a program for at-risk youth. A year later, the woman came back to the court, not to file another claim, but to thank. She had found out that the young man had been able to get a part-time job and was helping his mom pay for her medication. The bike was still working, and so was his new path in life. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment. It's about giving people a chance to turn things around. Story 27. A man walked into my courtroom, visibly distraught. He was facing a lawsuit for breaking a neighbor's window during a dispute. The neighbor had pressed charges for property damage, and it was clear that the man had thrown something out of frustration, but it wasn't intentional. When I asked him why he was so upset, he said, "I lost my job. My wife left, and now I've ruined my relationship with the one person who was ever kind to me." His neighbor, an older man, had been the one to offer him food when times were tough and had helped him fix his car. But after their argument, the man had snapped, throwing a rock that broke the neighbor's window. I called the neighbor into the courtroom and asked if there was any possibility of a resolution. The older man looked at the defendant and sighed. I never wanted to see him in trouble. I just wanted my window fixed. I proposed an agreement. The defendant would pay for the damages and spend the next month helping his neighbor with small tasks around the house. The neighbor reluctantly agreed. A few months later, the man came back to thank me. He was working again, and his relationship with the neighbor had healed. Sometimes, all it takes is someone showing a little kindness to spark a change. Story 28. A 15-year-old boy stood before me, accused of shoplifting. The store manager had called the police after finding the boy trying to steal a pack of gum and a soda. The boy seemed nervous, and when I asked him what had happened, he began to shake. I didn't mean to steal, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have money and my mom's sick. I wanted to buy her something. Anything. She hasn't been able to leave the house for weeks. I paused, looking at the boy. It was clear he wasn't a typical shoplifter. He wasn't doing it for fun or to make a profit. He was just a kid trying to care for his mom. I asked the store manager if they were willing to drop the charges if the boy made restitution and performed community service. The manager agreed, under the condition that the boy also attend a youth program for at-risk teenagers. 6 months later, the boy came back to thank. He had a job now and was able to help his mom with her bills. He had turned his life around, and it all started with the opportunity to make things right. Justice isn't always about punishing people. Sometimes it's about helping them find the right path. Story 29. A woman stood before me, asking for a restraining order against her ex-husband. He had been harassing her, showing up at her house uninvited and making threats. She was scared, and understandably so. As I listened to her testimony, I saw the pain in her eyes. But when I asked him about his actions, his response shocked me. I just want to fix things, he said, his voice trembling. I love her, and I know I messed up, but I just want her back. It became clear that this wasn't a case of stalking or abuse. It was a case of unresolved emotions and desperation. He hadn't been able to cope with their divorce. I didn't immediately grant the restraining order. Instead, I ordered the two of them to attend therapy and counseling sessions. I told him that if he wanted any chance of reconciling, he needed to respect her boundaries and work on himself first. Months later, the woman returned, not asking for the restraining order anymore, but to thank me. You gave him a chance to get better, she said, and he has. We're not together, but he's a different man now. Justice is often about healing, not just protecting.